Okay, so I guess first off, a big thank you to Peter at Procedural Worlds, who took the time to explain this technique to me on the Discord. I'll leave a link down below in the description. The workflow I just want to quickly go through is using SECTR to chunk up terrain into tiles, into sectors, and then using what World Streamer would call ring streaming. So around the player, only have the terrain, you know, your normal Unity terrain, but around in the distance, replace that kind of costly in terms of performance Unity terrain with just low poly mesh versions of the terrain. SECTR uses this idea of proxy meshes, so that's what we're about to do. So first of all, select the terrain. This is a 4K terrain, and the process of tiling it is super easy in SECTR. Just select the terrain utility, choose the number of tiles that you want. So I've already got actually a mesh proxy for my terrain, and I've split it into 16 by 16, so I'm going to match that. And yes, I do want to split the terrain. So if I click on sectorize, it's just going to run off and do its thing. Okay, so it's done its thing. I can close that little tool. You can see literally the sectors, which are all listed underneath a kind of a parent object. The next part, which isn't clear in the documentation, is how do you add the proxy meshes. Once you know, it's dead easy. You need to add the chunk, or is it chunk component, to your terrain, to the sector that contains the terrain. You don't need to worry about the scene path or node path. When you actually export all these sectors into scenes that, you know, load up through asynchronous scene loading, that gets filled in automatically. What you do need to fill in is the mesh. So what's the proxy for this terrain? What will be loaded instead of the terrain? So when this sector is disabled, instead you'll see whatever is inside here, and you need to enter both the mesh and its material. Now it comes with a little tool. So as I mentioned, let me save this scene. I've got a terrain, so it's the same terrain that I had before, but I've run it through Mesh Materializer, which essentially is a utility that actually it does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is it allows you to easily chunk a terrain into tiles, and you can define, you know, kind of the poly count and vertex count. So you can see as I'm running through all these assets there, they're highlighted, and they're my low poly. If I open one of those, you can see it's a mesh. Literally is just and I've kind of set it, I only wanted about 2.5K verts, but it is just a low poly mesh version of what terrain would be underneath there. And there's a very simple basic material which is exported also from Mesh Materializer. It does also generate out more complex splat maps, but we're dealing with meshes that aren't going to be viewable in the distance, so it's kind of up to you. You know, there is a discrepancy. You'll notice it. You'll see the difference between the mesh and the terrain when we run the final build. But yeah, keep things as low performance as you can, I guess. So there's a number of ways I've so far found of actually adding these proxies. One way is just you select them all, then you would be literally paste. So if that's my YY, my essentially the equivalent of that first sector over here, you can drag it in. It's it's going to be a long way up, isn't it? But if I drag that up, so I think something that becomes pretty apparent right away is there is definitely going to be a need for some additional kind of automation to make this process of matching the mesh to the terrain tile quite a bit easier. Not quite at the top yet. So this drag and drop solution, I would not recommend it. I've done it once and it's just time consuming and easy to make errors. I think wherever you can automate a process, it means that you're not going to accidentally drop the wrong thing in the wrong place. But I want to show you the proxy mesh tool. So given that I've dropped that in here, now the proxy mesh tool recognizes that there's something inside, and it sees the wrapper. The wrapper is just a container. It actually is used so that I can alter the pivot point of the terrain, which is useful if you're using WorldStreamer for your ring streaming, the equivalent of these proxies. It helps to have the pivot point in the right place, and that's why there's this kind of empty wrapper. But SECTR Chunk component is clever enough to see inside that and say, oh, there's a mesh, is that the one you want? I'm guessing that if there's more than one mesh inside here, you could select them all, and then you just literally click create proxy, and it creates this new mesh and it puts it inside, so everything lives in a folder that's named after your scene. There were the terrain splits that SECTR created. There's the first proxy, and so it's picked up the material from that original in here. It's created a mesh from there, and you can actually, as I found out from what Peter was saying, is having done that, you can now delete it. It's got the reference to the mesh and it's got a reference to the material, and that's it. So keep going all the way through. I guess another option might be if you've already got your so as I showed you, I actually already have tiles. I didn't need SECTR to make me these tiles. I can just say add a chunk, find the mesh. It's actually going to be easier for me to find it probably in here because I know where mesh materializers left them. So it would be this one, drag that in. How many materials? One. Find the material that I'm using, which was this one, basics. Possibly an easier, quicker way of doing it, but so I'll do it one more time so you get, so we're on the sector itself, we're adding the chunk component and the mesh. I'm going to need one, and my but I'm sure that there's an easy script to be written that would essentially run down all the sectors, look for the terrain name, look in a specified folder for a matching mesh, matching tile, add that, tell it which, and just run through, because as I say, just doing it by hand is not the best of ideas. But that's the process. The sector itself has the SECTR chunk component, it has a reference to the mesh, it has a reference to the material that the mesh is using. And if I open here's one I did, I don't need to save that, here's one I did earlier. You can see I've done essentially the same thing on every single one of these. There's a terrain, mesh, and its material, and that's it, nothing inside, just the terrain. Once if you're using the proxy mesh tool and dragging and dropping and clicking on the create proxy button, once that's happened you can delete the actual proxy itself. So that's the same scene as we had before. I think all I've done is I've added an aqueous plane because there's a bit of water. It's something I want to find out more about is actually that probably should live in one of these sectors or possibly in nested sectors. Again, Peter's been helpful in giving me some guidance on how to proceed with nested sectors, so that'll be the next thing that I look at. That's about it, apart from the fact that my first person controller camera now has a sector loader, and I think I've added just a bit of post-processing. And this NGSS contact shadows, that's screen space shadows. Something that I'm going to do next is to add vegetation to each of these terrain. I'm going to use Vegetation Studio, but it's still quite heavy on performance, so you've got to balance. Main things are things like the number of items of vegetation, so not too many different types of trees and different types of grass and flowers. Keep that pretty minimum if you can. Also not too dense, so not too high numbers. Even if you've got not too many types, so you also need to keep the numbers fairly low if you don't want that lag as the sectors load in. Also, I'd recommend turn off shadow casting on the small objects, so things like especially grass and flowers, and replace it with screen space shadow solution, whichever one works for you. So that's the first bit. You would then build settings. So what? SECTR STREAM. Let me show you where that lives. So it lives in here, SECTR STREAM, and export all sectors. Yeah. So I'm going to follow best practice and run my initial test with no foliage at all. So this is just the terrains and just the proxy meshes. So you can think of the proxies as kind of a LOD for your terrains. In the distance, they get replaced by a low poly mesh instead of displaying full Unity terrains. This takes a little while, so I'll speed it up for the next bit. Okay, so it's done its thing. Took a while, but there are a lot of tiles, 256 of them I think, and you can close it. You can see all your scenes are now in the project, plus the one that we're currently on. So I guess the first thing to notice is instead of all the terrain tiles that we had, we've just got the sectors. They're all disabled. If you've got the sector window, stream window open, you can individually import them if you're working on one of them. But let me zoom out. All you're left with are these guides, and this you can just press play, and if I move this window in, give you an idea what's going on. As we're moving around now, it's doing a rather good job because of the proxies. You would think that we're still all loading terrains, but in fact only some of the terrain, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 around the player are loaded, and everything else are the actual proxies. Now they don't unload like they do in World Streamer where you're ring streaming, but actually, as I found, that's not a bad thing. If you've got the memory overhead for your game, it's one less thing to load. And one of the big, let me zoom in a bit so you can see, one of the big issues. Yeah, so there you see that difference between, there's the player, we've got proximity setting on the player of max depth 1, so it's literally 1, 1, 1, 1. Now if I had one request to make to the SECTR developers, I think it would be better if the kind of the 1 was also adjacent, because as you run up to that edge you can start, it doesn't seem to trigger. You can see why, because of the way that the sectors are being done. It doesn't seem to trigger that next one until just a little bit too late, in my opinion. That becomes really obvious when you get close to, for example, there you are, you see it in here. So if I zoom back and see if we can trigger a similar event, so you get closer, 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 and then it goes, and you get too close in a way to the edges, to the difference between the terrain and these low poly meshes. That's a mesh, that's a terrain. Okay, so I mean, even in the editor we're getting no lag, and for an editor, you know, playthrough, it's actually pretty good. Frame rates. While I'm here, I'll do a build just to prove my point. So let's do textures only. I think to a certain extent you might think that doing a build at this stage is overkill, but you do not get real performance profiling in the editor. So the asynchronous scene loading just glitches. It just does in the editor. You don't get true streaming. Also, if you're doing any profiling in the editor, you're not going to get the full performance of your app. So I would recommend you take developer build and auto connect profiler, and then when you're running these actual builds, you will be asked, because of this link, you will be asked whether you want to allow it. If you've got the profiler open in Unity, it will auto connect and you'll be able to profile and look to any issues. So here we are. Now we're talking of about 450 FPS, which is pretty impressive, I would say, and no glitches is weird. I'm just loading a new scene. Just no, yeah. So these chunks and proxies are being replaced with real terrain, and it's smooth, and we're getting high frame rate. That's the important bit, and it's a lesson I've learned from Recon, also goes by the name of Dark on the Discords. Get your terrain right first. Deal only with, you know, flat matte textures. Get that working, high frame rate, so you know you've got a good base to work off. So we've done the first bit. For Vegetation Studio, I've got a script. So first of all, I'm going to need to load in these sectors. So SECTR STREAM, and just import all of them. I don't need a backup, I'm fine. You'll notice each of those then reloads in its content essentially, which in our case is just a single terrain. We've got lots of terrains, and I've got a script I wrote for Vegetation Studio, which takes a resource package which I've created already. I'm not going to go into the details. It adds persistent storage to any of the terrains it finds in the scene, and then bakes it to a store. So just call it that. And if I click setup and base, it's essentially telling me this is going to take a while. It'll depend on how many tiles you've got. It depends on the number of vegetation items you've got. I guess I should make it plain that I'm working in 2017, Unity 2017.417, and therefore I can't use Vegetation Studio Pro, which, if you saw the recent messy video, it makes this process much easier. But for 2017 and the normal Vegetation Studio, your best option for this kind of streaming setup is probably just to add on each one of the terrains of Vegetation Studio system. So essentially I run this utility which does that, but again it takes a while, so I'm just going to go straight into a scene that I prepared earlier, and there are the sectors, same as we were using before. You might start hitting a few memory issues if you turn on the vegetation to start vegetation system for all of these. So what have we got? They're the sectors. It's the portal. So I've got one Vegetation Studio manager. You add it from add Vegetation Studio to scene. When you do that, I mean, I didn't notice that there's already one, but when you do that, you get one of these, plus inside it you'll get a vegetation system. You can delete that vegetation system. You essentially just want the manager, and if you're using it, the touch react system. And then the utility that I was just showing you has added the vegetation package on each of the terrains. So it adds the vegetation systems. If I don't just this one, it added the package that I'd selected, and then it created the storage on the fly, and then it baked that's the vegetation that's stored inside the package, and then it actually baked it. So, and I know it's baked it because the actual stored is, so you've got about 3.2 megabytes per terrain tile. So they're the kind of things you start thinking about, is so how many of these different items, and what's the density of each of the items, because that's all being loaded in and initialized as each of the sector chunks become, is loaded in your scene. So that's essentially the setup for Vegetation Studio. So not Pro, but Vegetation Studio, that on each of these terrains I've got I've added the vegetation system. So something else that Peter showed me in the past was this way of pooling these vegetation systems, and it does work. The problem is I found that the actual pooling brought some overhead. It actually seems to be much more efficient just to have them on and bake every single tile. If you start getting into these infinite repeating terrains, so you get to the edge of the terrain, but then it loads the next, the tile on the other side, so that you essentially can keep walking forever and ever. Once you do that, then a pooling system starts to make sense. But for a static authored terrain, actually having just every tile baked and with its own system in place seems to be more efficient to me. But I guess you just test it and profile it for yourself. So sectors, we cut our terrain, then we added the chunks, and we added the proxy mesh and the material for each of the terrains. As you see, this path has been auto-entered, and I can now export all the sectors again, because you know, at this stage you would have done all of your work. Now this is going to take, I should have thought about it, this is going to take a little while, as it recreates essentially all the scenes for each of the sectors. Okay, so we're back. So something that I noticed, I kind of wish I hadn't, you know, had to re-import everything, but it does show you some of the issues that crop up. One of them that I found is you get your console spammed with errors. Essentially, it's trying to access a game object which has been disposed of and is now null. So just beware, but actually, as it turns out, you can clear it and it doesn't come back again until the next time you do your export. Also, things are, I'd say, pretty okay. So we got our scene. We're essentially back to what we had before when we just did the export with just the terrains inside each sector, but we now have a Vegetation Studio manager, and on each of the terrains it's been exported, as well as the chunk component. We've also got a vegetation system which has a baked, where is it, a Vegetation Studio persistent store package. So that's what we've got. Let's build so we actually get a proper feel for what we've got. Okay, so here's the profiler trying to connect. I'm actually going to close that. The error is to do with the profiler trying to connect and failing on that IP. So let's move that. Okay, move that up a little, and the reason I want to move that up a little is I want you to be able to see at the bottom the min frame. So I'm zooming along. Obviously this is not, you know, one of the issues with this terrain is you've got very long sight lines, so there's nothing to hide what's going on. You see the vegetation distance ending, you're seeing those tiles loading in. Now if you observe, and you'll notice that we got a -1 appear, and that's the load, but actually in game, and I'm running a pretty fast speed, there is no glitching really. It's just, I guess the FPS counter is just panicking for that frame or so that it loses count as the async loads are occurring. But yeah, I'm running up, got a slight glitch there, I think, possibly, but we're at 300 odd frames. I'm also, you know, kind of going at a fairly ridiculous speed that you probably wouldn't go in game. I slightly messed up my vegetation package, so I'm missing some trees down there. If I get back, down into the valleys, I just didn't set the height properly, but you can see I'm kind of running back down at 150, and you can see that difference between the terrain tile and the chunk proxy. So there's obviously going to be some work to be done to get those textures matching better, and I think it would make sense to not have such long sight lines, you know, to design your environment so actually you're hiding kind of those changes between one part of the scene, one chunk, and the other. But you can see it, you know, it's running well now. I think it okay, so we've seen the build, and decent frame rates, just to essentially let you see what's going on behind the scenes. So it's focusing on our player, maybe not quite that much, and so you could see how Vegetation Studio is going to be. So it's disappearing in the scene view, the vegetation, but that's because of its culling in that scene camera, as it were. But you can see in the game view it's kind of adding the necessary foliage as we're running through. Move back out again. You can see the billboards, the tree billboards in the distance. So obviously it's hiccuping because we're in the editor, but you can kind of see what it's doing in the scene view, this kind of one by one proxy. Now I did try a 2 nearest neighbor setting. I mean, which is on the camera, so max depth of 2, but was not getting anywhere near the same performance, and it was kind of overkill in a way because it was then loading these ones. But hey, let me show you what it looks like. I can't remember if you do it, you can do it on the fly or not. No, you have to stop. So you can set that to 2. So you can see immediately that the number of terrains that are being loaded is much greater. It was, you know, I've tested the differences, and I don't think it's worth the extra performance hit. It's as they're all unloading and loading, you do start getting lagging. So personally I would go with 1, but the one thing you can start exploring is just the different size of tiles, and my understanding is the more vegetation you have, the smaller the tiles should be. So huge tiles with a lot of vegetation lag when they load. There's just too much data being loaded and initialized. So the more vegetation, I've been finding the smaller the tiles are. But I guess that's probably best left for another video. I hope this was useful to you. Well, just when I thought I was done with this video, I got a message from Camera Crazy on the Discord, who's rightly spotted a schoolboy error that I've made. So I've been talking about the shape of, you know, this cross shape that that's made by SECTR as it's loading in the terrain tiles, and complaining that you can essentially get right to the corner. Let me show you with the with this in view. So go back, you can essentially get right up to the corner of a terrain and then it loads, and it's because of the shape of this cross, which is not at all what you want in World Streamer, because if you get this 3x3 shape you never really hit the edge. But as it turns out, I'm just using the wrong components. I'm using SECTR Neighbor Loader, and I'll be talking about this max depth of 1. He suggested that instead instead of using Neighbor Loader, I should have been using, and you can see there are a number of different loaders. In fact, you can't see because they're hidden behind at the bottom of the I wonder if I can, is it something I can add here? Yeah, let me actually show you. So there are different loaders that I can use, and I've been using neighbor loader, and he quite rightly said no, instead you should be using the region loader. If I turn off this sector loader of 1, and I've now loaded the region loader, and it defaults to a size of 20. If I go into play mode, it's essentially got a little yellow box around the player, and it's literally just loading a region of 20 units around the player. But if I change that to 512, which is, my tiles are 256, so it kind of extends just over the edge. You can see how now that's capturing or encompassing that grid of 3x3, that grid of 9 terrain tiles, which is actually what we need. So obviously that's going to have a slightly bigger performance impact because you're now loading 9 terrain tiles rather than the previous 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I made a build. See if I can find it to just test this out. Now put this in the right place. Okay, here we go for a walk. Now I can't remember the figures for the previous version, so but if you kind of go back in the video, you'll see whether or not it has a significant impact or not. I will also be making these builds available, so both the sector and the world streamer builds, so you can compare them yourself. They're development builds, so they'll connect to your profile if you've got Unity open, and you'll be able to kind of investigate that, you know, where you're seeing that -1 min and it's kind of almost imperceptible lag that occurs. I think there are spikes that do appear in the profiler, and you can have a peek at exactly what it is that's causing that and see if you can optimize further. I'm guessing possibly one of the things that would be good to look at would be streaming in textures. That might help ease the pain of that kind of loading lag. But all in all, I'd say not a bad job done. Things are loading in quite nicely and smoothly. Job done.